Hero, have you ever found in your studies of Judaism that it is too legalistic, or more likely have you heard other people describe Judaism as legalistic, perhaps too much so for their tastes? In today's episode, we're going to talk about this perception of Judaism as being very professional. In today's episode, we're going to discuss this label of legalistic or legalism as applied to Judaism or the Jewish tradition, and hopefully bust a few myths along the way, talk about where this comes from, and what you might say to your friends who think Judaism is too legalistic for my taste, and we'll talk about that here in our live studio recording right after this bass. That's my silence recording for the non-initiated. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey Weissenberg and Hadar Ensemble, for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you to the live studio audience who is joining me here today. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. This is a podcast for Jew Curious people of all stripes and maybe even spots or circles, camouflage patterns. You do you. Just happy to be learning with you. If you yourself would like to take part in a future live studio session, all you have to do is go to YouTube. That's youtube.com. Look for me, Rabbi John, John Carrier, Carrier, and you can find out all the live streams that we've got coming up in the future where you can weigh in with your comments, your questions, or just chat with people in the community. That's my favorite part about doing this live, is the community of people who show up, ask great questions, and give great support to people. And I'm going to, for people in the live studio audience, I'm going to apologize in advance. I thought I was recovered. I've been recovering from a cold, which is why you haven't seen me so much lately. And I just had a massive coughing fit in the class that I just taught, and that was a little bit embarrassing. But you know what? We are, as my teacher, Rabbi Pat Fenton, would say, we are all blessed with human bodies such as they are. So sometimes we cough, sometimes we make other noises with our bodies, but that's okay, because without our bodies, we couldn't study Torah. So I'm glad to have one, and to, there's no real polite way to finish that sentence. So I will instead give shout outs to people who've joined us live here today. Really happy to be seeing my friends Karen from Philly and Trig, and Kathy is here as well. I saw Kathy. Ruthie has joined us. People are saying shalom. Hey, everybody, how are you? They're not even talking to me. They're asking each other how they are, which is great. So very glad to see all of you here today. This was the topic for today is Judaism legalistic? And somebody in the chat is already asking, so what does that even mean? Trig saying, that's a new topic for me. I'm curious on what this means. And I've decided to tackle this in its own video. This is a question that was asked on an Ask Me Anything section right near the end of when I needed to stop recording, but I didn't want to do it in the short version. I wanted to give it its own show because it's a question that I get quite a bit. This came up in a local Intro to Judaism class that I'm teaching as well, where not so much people saying, hey, Judaism is really legalistic, more so when students I have are talking to, let's say, their non-Jewish friends, and they say, Judaism, oh, that's too legalistic, or I've heard that Judaism is described as legalistic, and it's usually not a polite way of describing it. It's usually saying, that's a reason that I'm not interested, or that's a reason why that's not for me, or that's a reason that's not as good as the thing that I'm doing instead. So I wanted to get into that today because it is something that comes up quite a bit. And we'll get to that in just a second. So I will be pausing from time to time to cough and to take drinks of water, because that's where my throat is at today. But better that we be learning with imperfect bodies than not learning at all. Karen is sharing that she's got tornado weather where she is. A bit scary for Pennsylvania. I will say, Karen, that I grew up in Tornado Alley, right? That sort of strip of land right smack in the middle of the country, sort of the southern part of that in East Texas, where tornado sirens and tornado drills were a regularity for us, especially in the hill country there of East Texas, where the bedrock is very close to the surface of the soil. Almost nobody has a basement, so it's really hard to dig in to shelter. But I also spent a lot of time in Minnesota, where in Minneapolis area, there are lots of tornadoes there as well, but people have basements, and that's a good thing. So people are getting hit by tornadoes, and it's not great, and it's all over the country now. It's in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. So be safe, everybody, from tornadoes. Listen to those sirens. Don't think it's not coming for you. Like, if you see a tornado, do something about it. Get out of there, and just try to be safe. Let's see. We've got a great question from Vanessa. I may have to come back to this one. Well, we'll go ahead and address it just so I don't forget. Sometimes I forget to do stuff. So before we get started on the legalism of Judaism, this is kind of related. Vanessa asks, I was told it's better to be a good goy, parentheses, who follows the Noahide laws, than be a bad Jew who does not follow the mitzvot. Your thoughts, Vanessa is asking me. And I'm going to, let's say, share a different perspective on that. That is a perspective in a large part of the Jewish world, especially in the Orthodox outreach part of the Jewish world, where that's not necessarily looking to recruit. And I'm not necessarily looking to recruit either, but I think I have a little bit different stance toward people who are drawn to Judaism, who thirst for Jewish traditions and Jewish wisdom, and even belonging to the Jewish people. There is, and I've done a whole video on this, the idea of the Noahide Laws and the Noahide movement, and it was actually a big thrust from the Lubavitcher, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, can't speak either, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who really pushed a particular group of Hasidic Jews, the Chabad Lubavitch movement, to reach out across the world to find Jews who were maybe not doing as many of the mitzvot as he would have liked to see happen, and bring those Jews to doing more and more mitzvot. But at the same time, with these outreach efforts and the classes and pretty high-quality Jewish education that's being spread around the world right now, we're attracting the attention of not Jewish people as well. And so Rabbi Schneerson said, hey, while we're here, let's teach about the Noahide laws. And these are 7 principles that are given to Noah in the book of Genesis, saying, okay, it's not the same as the 10 Commandments, but some of them are very similar. Don't eat blood, don't commit adultery, and I talk more about it. Again, if you search YouTube Noahide and maybe my name, you'll find a video I did on that details it in greater depth. But at the same time, this group of people who were encouraging Jews to do more mitzvot, were actively discouraging people from converting to Judaism and saying, like, look, you don't have to be Jewish for God to love you. And that's true. I'm not disagreeing with him on that point. It's better that you stay what you are and observe these Noahide laws that are for everybody than to join the Jewish people if you're not sure that you can dedicate yourself to doing all of the mitzvot. And I think that's what maybe this rabbi meant by, or something similar. I don't know your rabbi, but I'll say that may be similar in sentiment to this notion that it's better to be a good goy, and I actually hate that word because it's used in the pejorative a lot of the time. It's better to be a good non-Jew than to be a bad Jew. And that can be true, but I won't say that it's categorically true. In the sense that I'm with my teacher, Rabbi Artson. If your soul thirsts for Judaism, study about Judaism. If that longing, if that thirst draws you into Jewish practice, listen to that call. If it draws you to be a part of the Jewish community and you feel like you can be in the Jewish family exclusively and follow the principle of, as we were learning this week in the Jew Curious School about Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bezeh, that we're all responsible for one another, and make your best efforts to pursue the mitzvot that you are capable of, then I think you should listen to that call as well. And I also hate the term bad Jew, because I think it's a term that a lot of Jewish people use to sort of beat themselves up when they are not observing all the mitzvot that they think they should be, or that they heard they should be, or that they see other people doing. I would encounter people at the synagogue and say, "Hey, are you coming to the Hanukkah party tonight?" And they'll say, "No, Rabbi, I'm a bad Jew. I made plans to go play darts instead." And I was like, "No, you're not a bad Jew. There are bad Jews out there." Bernie Madoff, and it's a little bit of Lashon Hara, but he was a public figure, so here goes. Bernie Madoff was a bad Jew, right? Bernie Madoff, not that he was just bad at being a Jew, but he was bad at being a human being. He stole from people, he lied to people, and in consequence, charitable organizations around the world saw their endowments go to zero. Including, but not exclusively, many Jewish organizations. So there were Jewish organizations, charitable organizations, and non-Jewish charitable organizations around the world that collapsed because he wasn't living Jewish values or even basic human values. And so there is such a thing as a bad Jew out there, but I like to say, short of Bernie Madoff, you're fine. Like you're not a bad Jew in my book just because you're not doing all of the mitzvot. And if anybody out there says they're doing all of the mitzvot, you know that they are either misguided or lying, because it is literally impossible in our day and age to perform all of the commandments in the Torah. So I get the sentiment that you should be happy with what you have. There's a statement in Pirkei Avot: who is rich? One who is satisfied with what they have. And so if you're not Jewish, there's something to be said for fully embracing who you are and also adhering to this pretty basic code of ethics provided by the Noahide Laws. However, I would never discourage somebody from seeking admittance, from joining the family, or for at least studying about it, just because they thought, well, I can't live the life like my rabbi lives, or I can't do everything like the Haredim who lived in cloistered neighborhoods in Jerusalem. Right? Because there are those who say anything short of that is a bad Jew, and I disagree with that wholeheartedly. So I'll say, if you're happy being not Jewish, the Noahide laws are a good thing to follow. It's not tough. It's like no murder, no adultery, no eating blood, and some other things like that. No stealing. Those are just good rules for life. If you are not satisfied not being Jewish, if your soul longs for connection to Torah and connection to Jewish people and support of Jewish people and exclusive solidarity to this family, that's a good start. And you can grow in your observance of mitzvot from there. So that's not really what we came to talk about today, but I wanted to make sure that we didn't skip over that question because it's a great one. Let's see what else is going on. Thank you, Kathy, for saying click like while we're waiting. I'm just going to put in a quick plug. I don't do this often, maybe not often enough, maybe too often. But I'll say, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And the reason I'm keen on this right now is that I'm yay close to 2,000 subscribers. And I don't want to, assign too much value to subscriber numbers. Some people call it kind of a vanity metric and things like that. But just because we're at like 1,992 subscribers, that's close to a round number. And I think it would be kind of cool to see us have that round number on the subscription page. So if you've been watching my videos for a while and you haven't subscribed, it costs nothing. Just click the subscribe button and help us get to that goal, and I'll be much obliged. So what else is going on today? Just want to read some of the chat before we dive into the topic. Let's see. Got tornado weather. Ruthie says, no need to be embarrassed about the cold. We've all been there. Just hope you feel better real soon. I think it was because I drank out of a glass that my daughter had been drinking out of. That's my wife has this policy of never drinking after the children. And sometimes it was actually my daughter. We went out. It was the last day of school. No, it wasn't the last day of school. I'd taken them to a meeting. I had a meeting, doing rabbi stuff, and didn't have childcare, so I took the kids to the meeting. And I said afterwards I would get them milkshakes. And so we got milkshakes, and then at the end of it, my daughter was like, well, I've drank most of my milkshake. I want to give the rest to mommy. And I'll say, well, that's really nice of you, but mommy probably won't drink it because mommy has a rule that she doesn't drink after the kids. And my wife, in addition to having her day job, sings in choirs and things like that, and really has to be careful about her voice. So she's really careful not to share germs. And so my daughter just looked crestfallen. I was like, look, it's not about you. You're not allowed to share stuff with mommy. And she's like, well, would you like it? And I said, okay, I'll finish your milkshake for you. And then I started coughing and sneezing. People are talking more about tornado weather, green skies. I remember that. I remember seeing green skies when I lived in Minneapolis as a precursor to tornado. As Greisicle shares about the mitzvot, by the way, a lot of those mitzvot are nixakumen, German or Yiddish for not to worry. Vanessa asks, why have so many mitzvot if they can't be followed? Well, the mitzvot that we're talking about, we often talk about the Taryag mitzvot. Taryag is letters for numbers. It means 613. When people went through the Torah, which was given to us in a certain time and place and condition. They went through the Torah and they counted up all these mitzvot and decided that there were 613 of them. And there's a couple of, and I say decided that, there's a couple of different countings. Maimonides has one set of 613. What's called a book called the Sefer HaChinuch has another counting of 613. They're not exactly the same, so just different reads on how they're counted and split it out, things like that. But there are 613 commandments. And several years, I'll say, after I converted, I went to my rabbi and I said, I like being Jewish, but I'm worried I'm not doing all 613 commandments. And he said to me, look, you can't. You literally cannot. A lot of them have to do with when there is a temple standing, right? A lot of these 613 is how to sacrifice animals at a temple. And because we don't have a temple, we are exempt from all of those, right? And then there's other things that have to do with being a farmer in the land of Israel. And if you're not a farmer in the land of Israel, again, that's another big list off the table. There are some that are mutually exclusive. There are times when mitzvot compete with one another, like sometimes, we don't put out fires on Shabbat, but it's also a mitzvah to preserve human life. So if putting out a fire on Shabbat will save somebody's life, we let putting out a fire supersede. And as my rabbi put it, if you're good for about 30 or 40 of them, you're probably the most religious person that you know. So that's, and everybody has a line. There's nobody who's doing it perfectly. It's a spiritual journey. It's a spiritual process for everyone. So why have so many mitzvot if they can't be followed? Because we're not perfect, but we are perfectible. Like, we are not supposed to be saints, but we are encouraged to strive. We are encouraged to strive to grow in holiness from one day to the next, not to be better than anybody else, but maybe to be better than we were yesterday. And if everybody was perfect out of the gate, where would we grow? And so that's why I think we have such a high number, because we have something to aspire to. Again, as it says in Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Tarfon says, it's not for us to finish the job, nor are we free to desist from it. So many people in the chat siding with my wife on this one. Do not do not drink after the kids. Yes, I've learned my lesson, but I probably already but I probably haven't. So it'll probably happen again someday. Vanessa, we're still on the topic of mitzvot. This really is a good introduction to the legalism aspect of it. Are there the top 20 out of the 613 mitzvot? Well, there is a top 10. Right. There's a top 10 up there, 10 commandments. Don't murder. Don't worship idols. Keep Shabbat. No coveting. Those sorts of things. Some of them are hard. Coveting is a hard one. I think some people are prone to coveting. And I'm sure I've coveted in my day things. I saw a car that was nicer than my car and really wanted that car. But then there's things like for Shabbat, especially if you are growing in your Jewish practice, if this is something you were born in, what they call a Shomer Shabbos household or a Shomer Kashrus household, getting into things like Shabbat and Kashrut, the Sabbath and the dietary laws, can be overwhelming if you weren't raised from infancy in that situation. As you're adding to your observance, a lot of people get put off because there are all sorts of rules about Shabbat and holidays. And the idea is that if you don't do it perfectly, then you shouldn't do it at all. And I think a lot of people stop there. They get overwhelmed by all the different rules and regulations. And so they opt out. They go, again, it's this path like, why be a bad Jew? And so they say it's all or nothing. And I think that is the wrong approach, especially if this is something that you're trying out later in your life. If you try to go all or nothing, 9 times out of 10, you're going to fail and you'll do nothing. And you won't receive the benefits of adding the spiritual practice to your life. You won't get the zchut, as more frum circles would say. You don't get the merit of it in the eyes of heaven, because baby steps are better than no steps at all. And so I'll say, if you are working on increasing the mitzvot in your life, start where it's easy. I read this great parable many, many years ago. I don't know exactly where it came from, talking about the mitzvot and all the opportunities that we have for fulfilling commandments, doing good deeds, repairing the world. That says the mitzvot, the Jewish laws, or the commandments in the Torah, are like jewels embedded in the pavement. Like, let's say you're walking down the street and you happen to notice a jewel that's stuck in the asphalt. And you reach down and you wiggle it, and it comes right off in your hand. You just put that right in your pocket, right? That was easy to pick up that jewel. And a few more steps, I don't know, I guess maybe there was a jewel heist while they were paving that street, so there's jewels in the street. But then you see another one, and you see another sparkle, and it's like, wow, that's even bigger than the first one. And you go for it, and you wiggle it, and it's not even budging. It just doesn't move. And you try and you try and try, and it's not coming up. And you give up, and then you walk down the path, and you see another one that's just sitting there, right? It's not even stuck in the pavement. It's just, sitting on the side of the road. You pick that up, put it in your pocket. And the mitzvot can feel like that. If you're, walking a path toward holiness, toward increasing how many mitzvot you do in your life, some of them are super easy, right? So, especially like if you're a vegetarian. I know a lot of people, when I ask them about kashrut on the Beit Din, they say, well, I'm a vegetarian, so it's pretty easy. If you're a vegetarian, kashrut gets a whole lot, the dietary laws get a whole lot easier. So some of these things are easy. Some of them take a little bit of work, and some of them just won't budge the first time you pass them. But maybe you walk down that road again later, and you see that hard jewel, and maybe there's been, some weather or a shift in the pavement. Maybe it's a different time of year, the pavement shrank or something like that, and you wiggle a little bit, and it comes up. Something you never had access to before now comes off easily in your hand, and you put that in your pocket. And this is probably the greatest metaphor I've ever encountered for increasing holiness in your life. Don't be discouraged by the things that don't come easy. Focus on the things that do come easy, and keep trying at the things that are a little bit harder. And you may be surprised that down the road, they become what was once impossible becomes much less impossible for you. So, Grycicle shares, you might gargle with warm sea salt water, first sign of a scratchy throat. So I'll try that as well. There have been days in either teaching in the Jew Curious School or being on a live chat where I would start it with a glass, or I'd start with a cup of hot water with honey and lemon, just to smooth that out. Here's another recipe from Karen. Half apple cider vinegar, half water restores the voice. So I'll give that a try as well. People are sharing this in their Jewish Facebook groups. That's really kind of you. Thank you so much. Let's see. Just see what other questions we have here. Some things about conversion. Trig asks, "What about being baptized, quote unquote? If you aren't dunked in water, are you a legal Jew? Is the acceptance of the Beit Din the final word?" So I'll speak for sort of the contemporary traditional view. That is the contemporary view of traditional Jewish law. And then we should really talk about legalism, because we're talking a lot about Jewish law in answer to people who say, it's too legalistic. So I will say, we'll agree with what somebody else here shared. Karen says, different communities have different standards. The most Bate Din that I've been a part of or have observed in their Orthodox communities, conservative communities, Reform communities, what have you, follow the principles laid out in the Shulchan Aruch and elsewhere, that conversion requires learning, it requires approval by a Beit Din, and it requires mikvah, right? And those are sort of the three main factors. If you are a person who possesses a penis, I'm not going to say are a man, because there's different standards of gender identity than there used to be. But if you're a person who has a penis, then it requires milah or brit milah or hatafat dam brit, which I explain in some YouTube videos that I have that have a lot of really snarky comments on them. I'll put it that way. So that's another step. But just about every Beit Din that I've observed or been a part of requires a Beit Din of 3 rabbis to approve you for conversion. But then the mikvah is the final step. Dunking in the water is what makes you sort of Jewish official. I have heard of Bate Din that did not require the circumcision aspect for various reasons, usually totally legitimate and by Jewish law. If somebody has medical issues, hemophilia, something about it would just be life-threatening, then there's an exception there. Differing views on that. I have never heard of a Beit Din that didn't require somebody to immerse in water as a part of their conversion. That's something we've been doing at least since the time of the Talmud. So that's pretty universal. The real difference is in the education aspect of it and the type of questions that the Beit Din might ask. In Orthodox communities, my understanding is you go to a Beit Din to ask permission to start studying for conversion, just to start the process. If you might be, before you study anything, you go to the Beit Din and they'll say, if you study, we might accept you. And then you start the process of learning that takes, in those circles, 2 years or much longer. And then you go to a Beit Din again. In other communities, you don't have the Beit Din on the front end. You might just have the learning and then the Beit Din at the end. And so it varies somewhat. In some communities, before you convert, they'll come to your kitchen and they'll check your fridge and they'll say, are you following all the dietary laws? Or they'll want to spend Shabbat with you and want to make sure that you do Shabbat the way they think Shabbat should be done. In other Bate Din, like the ones I sit on, we'll say, okay, we'll ask, what's your approach to kashrut? What's your approach to the dietary laws? What's your approach to Shabbat? And in those regards, because there's varying standards within varying communities, we're not going to say, okay, you have to hold this particular line. We do like to see that you've thought about kashrut and that you've tried kashrut and that you have some standards that adhere to the dietary laws, that you do make Shabbat different from other days of the week. Whether you're tearing paper is not something we go to your house and inspect, but that we do ask questions about it. So different Beit Dins, different standards for different communities. There is no one universal standard that's accepted by everybody. Even today in the modern state of Israel, the Rabbanut, the chief religious authority, is rejecting conversions done by Orthodox rabbis elsewhere that they don't recognize as being enough for them. So my advice is always, find your community first before you convert. Find a community that you want to be a part of, that you feel comfortable in, and then talk to the rabbis in that community about what are the proper standards so that I can feel secure and you can feel secure about me within this community. So with all that, we've been talking about for about half an hour now. Let's jump into this question of, is Judaism legalistic? And I feel like I've spent the first half hour demonstrating that it is. However, I would like to hotly contest this label that I think is often born out of, let's say, ignorance at best and prejudice at worst. And I think where it comes from is the fact that we do have these debates. I've kind of demonstrated this in the front end. We do have these debates about what's kosher, what's not kosher, what's okay according to the standards of our community, what's not okay according to the standards of our community. And these discussions can get pretty deep into the weeds. They could sound very inside baseball, as they say. I mean, we can fight over the tiniest of things, but why we retain this impression of legalism compared to other faiths is that we permit that kind of questioning and we record that kind of questioning. By contrast, usually when people are describing Judaism as legalistic, it's coming from a place of, most of the time, I'll say, Protestant Christian communities, where you don't always have that depth, or let me put it this way. People don't always feel, and this is just based on people that I've talked to, now I'm not making stuff up, based on my own experience growing up that way, and people I've talked to, people don't always feel encouraged to ask questions about tenets of their religion or tenets of their faith, which are two different things, religion and faith, and we can do a whole episode on that, I think. So, if you're a part of a particular, let's say, Protestant Christian community, or can be taught the basic set of beliefs of that community, the basic set of rules for operation for that community. And while there is some leeway of dissent and questioning permitted, it's not a feature of those communities to be debating over the fine points of those things that we agree to if we are a part of this community, right? That's what you get when you have a religion of creed or belief instead of a religion of practice, let's say. So we are a part of this community because we agree on these things. If you disagree with these things, then you are not a part of this community, right? And what that leads to is instead of having, let's say, a big major world religion with, I'm going to say, a relatively small number of different denominations. I mean, there's sort of the big three, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. There's also Renewal and Reconstructing and Humanistic. But we got nothing on the Christians, and especially nothing on the Protestant Christians. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of different denominations. And I think where this comes from is that we see each other as Jewish, whether we agree on what that means or not. And if we have major disagreements, we may gravitate toward one of a small handful of different types of congregation where people by and large agree with us more than they don't, right? But if you're in a system where we have a given set of beliefs, and if you don't believe the things that we believe, then you're not welcome here. You have a splintering of denomination. So instead of encouraging debate, encouraging conversation, it instead encourages division, speciation, and things like that. So if you're a part of a community where debating the finer points of law, behavior, belief, etc. is not encouraged, then looking out at Judaism and seeing, okay, here's a bunch of people that seem to be arguing about stuff all the time. And when they argue, they're arguing about just not even the big stuff. Like the big stuff, we by and large can agree on, with some notable exceptions. But we get into the weeds. We get into the small stuff. Do you wait? Let's say if you want to observe the dietary laws. At base, we agree on the principle that you shouldn't eat milk and meat at the same time. There later emerged a standard. What does at the same time mean? So they say, well, we wait a little bit, right? So if you eat milk and then you eat meat and it's like 30 seconds apart, right? Maybe I was, taking a bite of one thing. I turn to say hello to a friend and I go back and I take a bite of a different thing. Am I eating those things together, right? Or is there a certain amount of time that constitutes an appropriate separation? And if you were a part of the minhag or the custom of the community of Amsterdam, you might eat meat and then wait an hour to eat milk. But if you were part of the community in Germany, in Ashkenazi Germany, you might eat some meat and then wait 6 hours instead of an hour. And that's just differing customs in those differing communities. And so, especially nowadays, it used to be when you were a part of a Jewish community, you may not know, where people didn't travel so much and mass media and social media certainly wasn't a thing, you may not have been aware of other Jewish communities' customs, even though they diverged from your own. You were Jewish the way other people in your town were Jewish. And there wasn't multiple synagogues with multiple denominations for the most part. So everybody pretty much did the same thing. Nowadays, we have communities that have diverse Jewish populations, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, New York, Los Angeles, Boston, Philadelphia, major areas. But also online, people are sharing their different practices across the world. And so, yes, we get to argue about stuff. And sort of with the premise that, everybody who's arguing is Jewish pretty much. But we argue about stuff, and it makes it look legalistic. The other thing that makes it look legalistic is that we preserve those arguments, and we preserve all sides of those arguments. This was the great, I'll say, initiation of Rabbinic Judaism when we pulled together and published the Mishnah about the year 120 to 200 of the Common Era. This was a body of oral law, of people and scholars sort of carrying forward interpretations that weren't in the Torah itself, but were transmitted as sort of additional layers of understanding. So when God says, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, what do we mean by that? Well, people developed opinions about that, or some say God told Moses how to observe that, even though it's not explicit in the text, and Moses handed that forward for generations. And then people kind of picked that up, kind of a game of telephone, and eventually maybe people had different ways of doing things. And so by the time we got to 120 of the Common Era, when out of necessity, because the people who had memorized these oral traditions were dying off, we wrote all these things down. What you have is a document that says, okay, for any given thing you would do in Jewish life, starting with what time do you say the bedtime Shema, there's within that at least 3 opinions from the outset as to how to do that, right? I think it was Rabbi Eliezer said you do it up until the end of the first watch. The Hachamim Omrim, or sort of the major majority accepted rule, was you do it until Chatzot, or the middle of the night. And Rabban Gamliel said you have up until sunrise. So when we first started writing down different interpretations or glosses on how to observe the commandments in the Torah, we not only wrote down the majority opinion, but also all of the minority opinions as well. How do you light Hanukkah candles? Well, there's a passage in the Talmud called My Hanukkah, like, what is Hanukkah? How do you do it? And one rabbi says, Rabbi Shammai says, when you're lighting Hanukkah candles, you light 8 candles on the first night, 7 candles on the second night, 6 candles on the third night, and so on until 1 candle on the last night. Rabbi Hillel says, no, that's not how you should do it. You do it 1 candle the first night, 2 candles the second night, 3 candles the third night, and so on up to 8 candles on the 8th night. And everybody knows that's that second way. That's how you light Hanukkah candles. Like, I don't know a place in the world that lights Hanukkah candles starting with 8 and working their way down. So why did we preserve in a sacred document Shammai's minority view? Because that's our way. Not only do we encourage discussion, but we show to future generations that we encourage discussion by recording every single different opinion that was had on this topic. Because we recognize from the outset that we were going to be living in different places at different times with different prevailing circumstances, right? And if you listen to Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah about when's the right time to say the bedtime Shema, and he says until the end of the first watch, and the watch was a time based on a function of security in a walled city. Well, what if you don't live in a walled city, right? What if you live out in the country, or what if you live in a city that doesn't have a watch? What if it's the time of Mashiach and we don't need watchmen anymore? When might some different condition prevail that we might need a different opinion that suits the people better while maintaining the integrity of the law? And so I think what makes it appear legalistic is that our documents, our sacred documents are legal documents that preserve not just the statute, but all of the case law as well, all of the discussion, all of the debate, all of the disagreement. And so that looks from the outside, that looks like legal rambling. It's like, how do you call that faith? If people believe 3 different things about the same idea, how can they be part of the same community? This is just legalistic wrangling. And I'll say to that, thank you. Maybe I should proudly claim that title. Yes, we are a legalistic faith. But I have a different idea of what that law means. And so, and I'll just share, I don't know if I've shared this with you guys before, but this is my particular view on Jewish law. I am in love with it. This is something, when I was in rabbinical school, not a lot of electives in rabbinical school, at least where I went, but we do get to choose some electives later in later years of study. I gravitated toward Jewish law. Like I gravitated toward halakha, which, by the way, halakha means walking or the path. It doesn't mean like the fixed position. It means the path, the journey that you take. I'll hearken back to talking about those jewels in the pavement. This is the way that you walk, and sometimes there are twists and turns. Sometimes there are detours. Sometimes there are roadblocks. Sometimes there are treasures to be found in the path that are easy for you, and sometimes not. And so I'm perhaps a biased person to be answering this question, like, is Judaism legalistic? Because I see Jewish law as being how do I put this in a way that properly captures both reverence and love for it? I see Jewish law as being the primary interface between humans and God. I see Jewish law as being the primary interface between 2 yearnings of our own nature. On the one hand, we strive for holiness. We strive for connection to God. We strive to do all of the mitzvot that we can because we love God. Or so, I'm not going to speak for everybody. There's a lot of Jewish atheists as well. But we have this revelation of what God wants for us and from us. God wants for us a world of plenty and peace. Wants from us to imitate God's attributes of justice and mercy and humility and kindness. And that's a tall order, right? It's like, if anybody could do it, there wouldn't be God, right? If everybody could be just like God, it wouldn't be such a special thing. And I'm looking for tornadoes and lightning bolts right now. But that's a high standard that we aspire to. At the same time, we live human lives. And those human lives are messy. Sometimes we catch cold because we sipped our daughter's milkshake when we shouldn't have. Sometimes we have jobs. Sometimes we have families to support. Community responsibilities and things like that pull us away from our highest aspirations. We are not told to be saints. There is a passage that says you will be like a nation of priests and a holy people. But that's more of our level of attachment to holiness than it is a measure of our flawless saintliness, which is an aspiration in some faiths, but not in ours. We are told, no, you got to do your job. You got to take care of your business. You got to take care of your family. You got to take care of your community. You got to stay in a relationship with that spouse that you fight with sometimes, right? All the vicissitudes of human life are connected to mitzvot and are connected to holiness in a way. It's like we wouldn't be doing what we need to do in the world. We couldn't aspire to the holiness of tzedakah if we didn't earn a living and have some surplus to give to charity to help people. Right? We couldn't fulfill the mitzvah of pru'ervu if we didn't engage in real dialogue with people that we're in relationship with in order to have offspring, as it were. Right? We have these two things pulling at us: holiness and just the nature of the world and living in it and the necessities of that. And in my mind, the project of Jewish law is to be the interface between those two things, saying, okay, this is what God expects of you. This is what your life is like in the world. Let's meet in the middle, right? Let's take the mundane things like eating and working and resting and playing and being in relationship with human beings and say, you don't have to dispense with those things to be constantly living in the ether, but here's where we're going to meet in the middle, right? Yes, you have to eat in order to live, but don't eat blood. Right? In the very beginning, we're sort of vegetarian, right? That's one of the first innovations that we see is in the very beginning. We're told that all the grasses of the field and the fruits of the trees in the Garden of Eden are ours to eat. No meat. It doesn't say anything about meat. It's only at the time of Noah where God sees that people are going. If I have animals around here, people are going to eat them, and so let's have some rules. Don't eat blood. Don't eat roadkill. Don't take a bite of a living animal because that's just cruel. So you're not going to be vegetarian, but if you're going to eat meat, you're going to eat this kind of meat this certain way. That's a compromise, right? That is that middle path where holiness and our worldliness touch. And that's why I'm so dedicated to learning Jewish law, and I'm still have a lot to learn myself, and teaching it as much as I can, because I think that is the best place for me to live, and I like to pay that forward and share it with people. And so, yes, this legalism can seem like wrangling and putting too fine a point on thing. What if I'm just a good person, right? And I submit that it's hard to be the best person you can be without a little bit of guidance, without a little bit of mindfulness and consideration and things like that. And Jewish life is a curriculum for learning how to express that good personness in a very tried and true and tested way, in a way that also identifies you with a people who are all responsible for each other. And so if somebody says, well, I'm not interested in Judaism because it's so legalistic, what they're probably saying is it has so many rules that are requirements for me that I don't see adding value in my life. And if I don't do all of those requirements, I can't be a part of the community, right? Because that's their experience in, let's say, for example, a Protestant Christian community, right? If I don't believe all of these things, I'm not a part of this community. And so within Judaism, it's like we're all a part of the community, whether we like it or not. Some of us, like, you might be born into it and never really connect with it. Some people are volunteers, like myself, and I don't necessarily like everything that goes on in the Jewish community. I don't necessarily like everything that goes on in Israeli politics and things like that. And I don't follow the dietary laws the same way as every other Jewish person who follows the dietary laws, and some don't. But I acknowledge that we're all a part of the same community. I acknowledge that we have a shared tradition within which everyone negotiates and grows in following those things that they are capable of. And the negotiation about those finer points of laws is each of us figuring out for ourselves, how do I live in both a human world and in a world of Kedusha, in a world of connecting to holiness. And I don't mind being on that fence and doing that work. In fact, that work has been a spiritual journey for me and for a lot of other people that I know. The other aspect of Judaism being sort of legalistic is people take a look at the Gospels and things like that, where I was just reading the Gospel of John the other day. Yes, I do sometimes read the New Testament just for cultural literacy purposes mostly. But reading about this finer point of Jesus healed somebody and it happened to be on Shabbat. And Jesus said, okay, pick up your mat. Now you're healed. Pick up your mat and go home. And people got on his case because the rabbis were like, hey, we don't carry mats on Shabbat. And Jesus said, feh, on not carrying mats or something like that. Like, yes, that's a thing. A part of the community doesn't carry things on Shabbat. It wasn't because he was healing him. It was because the guy was carrying a mat. And there's a whole section of the Talmud on we don't carry stuff on Shabbat. And even that wrangling that Jesus was doing with the rabbis at the time was a part of the same legal tradition of legal discussion and argument that people later accused Jews of. What Jesus was doing in the Gospels was engaging in that same kind of dialogue, that same interface between worldliness and holiness. And later on, these same so-called Christian communities would come back at us and say, yeah, we don't worry about that stuff because here's a list of the things that we all do. And if you don't do all those things, you're not part of the community. I would rather default to being in community and being able to have discussions with people, being able to argue with people and disagree, because I know that those disagreements, even if we come out on wildly different places, those disagreements endure and will be preserved. If you take a look at the Talmud, it is basically a book of statute and case law, about the size of a Saturday encyclopedia. I think read someplace like 5,000 pages or something like that. Actually, no, it's not 5,000 pages. It's 5,000 arguments, approximately 5,000 arguments, of which 50 arguments come to resolution. So of 5,000, so 50 out of what is that, like 1% of all arguments in the Talmud come to perfect resolution. The ones where they don't, we record all the different opinions on a particular subject, which lets us ask questions, which lets us search, which lets us grow in ways that traditions that don't permit argumentation or preserve argumentation, for me, are not a path of growth. So that's kind of what I wanted to get across with this. I don't worry too much about what other people say about Jews unless it comes to blows or physical violence or things like that. But I'll say we are legalistic. No, we're not legalistic in the sense that that's a bad thing. We are curious. We are occasionally argumentative, but we are respectful enough of one another that we don't dismiss someone just because they have a different opinion of us. Instead, we record the argument, record the different outcomes of that argument, because we respect each other enough to engage and permit dialogue and different opinions. And when you write that stuff down, it starts to look like legalism. And that's okay. I'll take it. So just want to go back. I've been yammering for a while now. I want to go back over the chat. Let's see what else is going on. Jack Wolf, glad you could join us today. Let's see who else is here. Hey Milo, good to see you here, buddy, from Denmark. Always nice to see Milo. We are international. I know we are bicoastal and international in this podcast, so I'm excited to see everyone. The Beit Shammai house at Penn lights 8-1. Does that mean there's there's a Hillel house and a Shammai house as well? That's interesting because there's the Hillel house in a lot of congregations. I've never heard of a Shammai house. These were sort of two historic debaters in the rabbinic literature. Just seeing who else is here. All right, everybody. With that, we're about at the hour mark, and I want to preserve my voice for teaching a class later tonight. So I'm gonna take a drink of water, and I'll close just in case one of these days I get this edited into a podcast in the podcasty format. Really enjoyed the discussion that we had today, heroes in the live studio audience, and most of all, I want to thank you, hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. This is a podcast for Jew curious people of all kinds. And if you'd like to get to know some other Jew curious people just like you, the best thing to do is to join our private Facebook group. And you can find out all you need to do to get into that private Facebook group by going to jewcurious.show/JCC, as in Jew Curious Community Center. This is a private, lovingly tended, carefully guarded, troll-free zone for people to get to know each other, share questions, share concerns, share support with one another on whatever path you're on, and I'd love to see you there. Finally, I want to give a big shout out to my students and friends in the Jew Curious School. This is a private online school for Jewish learning. We have a full Introduction to Judaism class, as well as some more in-depth learning series and a weekly discussion of the Torah portion of the week. But my favorite part about the Jew Curious School is the fantastic community of students that we have. Right now, we've got about 4 students in there who are learning together, but also getting to know each other, sharing questions, sharing answers, sharing resources, sharing support with one another, jokes, recipes, books that people like. All this is happening, but I'm going to tell you, I love Torah. I love learning Torah and teaching Torah, but I have been really blown away that I think what I love the most is the community that comes together around learning about Judaism, learning about Jewish stuff, learning about Jewish people, because I firmly believe in my heart of hearts that this is a path of achieving greater meaning in your life, greater joy, greater human connection, and greater personal growth. And I can't wait to continue learning with you soon. Until next time, hero, peace. All right, everybody. Thank you for battling through this cold with me. Really enjoy how everybody seems to enjoy each other asking great questions, tough questions. You really challenge me as well as germs challenge me. But really, always glad to learn with you all. We are going to be having another discussion at 1 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow. Hope to be back on a more regular schedule. 1 p.m. is looking like a pretty good time slot for us. So look for more topics, and if you have ideas for other topics you'd like us to go deep on, please put those in the comments below this video. Make sure you give us a thumbs up if you like this video. Make sure you are subscribed so that you'll get notified when new live stuff is coming out, and just really grateful to have you to learn with today. Thanks to the person who I forget exactly, maybe it was Jack who posed this question in the first place, but thanks for that. Think it was a lovely thing to talk about. So I'll say this to you in my live studio audience. Until next time, heroes, peace.